welcome to the 8th Subdivision of the Western Pacific. This is a fictitious extension of the prototype WP that's set in northern Utah just before the merger, which happened in 1983. We like to establish a late 70s, early 80s sort of a feel to a railroad that could have existed, but fits into my basement a lot better than something that is an exact copy of the prototype. So right behind me here is Junction City, Utah, which is patterned very heavily after Ogden. Some of the industries here are very heavily based on Ogden industries that were served by other railroads like the Union Pacific or the Rio Grande. But we try to establish the location with right behind me, Mount Ogden, and the scenery that exists on the prototype, and let the viewer kind of place themselves right here in Utah at the time of being modeled, and let their minds kind of settle into the place. One of our important customers at Junction City, Utah is this large flour mill, which was scratch built following what is currently owned by Graincraft and at one time was Sperry Flour. It's a major structure that sits behind the Union Pacific Ogden yard, and it has a distinctive look. This is what I like to call a signature structure, something that really sets the location, and anyone familiar with the Ogden yard knows what this building is. In fact, the design and construction of this building was covered in a previous TSG Multimedia video on how to build a signature structure, so you may want to check that video out. But I think things like this help eliminate the generic look that we have on so many of our railroads, and this replaced a very generic Walther's kit bash structure that, it wasn't bad, but it looked like the type of building you see on 100 other layouts, and I wanted something distinctive. So this is something that, draws the viewer's eye and lets them know that we're not just in generic city USA, we're in a specific place. Another important industry here in northern Utah was the fruit and vegetable canning industry. And although the Western Pacific itself didn't serve a lot of, fruit and vegetable cannery type places, other railroads in the area did. And I thought it would be nice to have this industry represented here at our fictitious Junction City. So this is the Northern Utah Canning Company. This is the type of structure that I like to model for operations because it has multiple different places to spot cars. We have an inbound track for can stock and cans, places to load outbound canned goods, and we also have a track with a tank car unloader so that we can bring in things like corn oil or corn syrup. I like the fact that this is a jumble of buildings of different eras. There's the sky bridge across the tracks. We have some piping across the tracks for the heating plant and so on. Typical of our local industries like the old Del Monte cannery in Ogden, this one has structures that look like they were thrown up at different times over the decades, and it adds a lot of interest to make this an interesting customer to switch. Here's another one of our important local industries in northern Utah, steel fabrication. We used to have a major steel mill in Utah County, Geneva. Coil steel was shipped all over locally to manufacture all sorts of things, highway products, roof trusses. And so this is another type of industry that I wanted to have to give the feel for northern Utah. They all seem to have these big scaffold signs along the roof. So I had a friend of mine laser cut that for me. This takes inbound coil steel and then takes outbound scrap loads. And it gives a way for us to represent something very typical to northern Utah and, again, drop the viewer into our local history as they're running trains. Let's continue our tour of the 8th Subdivision from the timetable east end of the railroad. This track here goes to 25th Street and the downtown Junction City branch line that we visited earlier. But this track goes down to staging, and this is where mainline trains will come and go off the model portion of the railroad. Note that instead of doing a tunnel or a bridge, I wanted to try something a little different for making the scene disappear. So I've got this water pipe that runs across the main track. And there are several places here in northern Utah that have similar pipes that run across highways and so on. And I thought that made a little bit of a different scene than what we're used to seeing on a railroad. And we have the Junction City Yard office here. This is a kit from Monster Model Works that was modified to look a little more like something that belongs here in Utah. The prototype is from New England, but it has this new overhang that I added to shield the people inside from the very strong Utah sun, because I figured this place probably was going to bake them alive in the Utah summer heat. And I also put this big air conditioner on the roof. So just subtle modifications that make a structure look like it didn't just come out of the box that way, and that it fits into the local environment. And right next to the yard office, we have the intermodal terminal. Western Pacific had a very small intermodal operation like this on its Par yard in Reno, Nevada, but this is also similar to the old intermodal terminal that the Union Pacific had adjacent to its north yard in Salt Lake City. Just a big broad area with a little pavement and a lot of dirt where trailers were offloaded and kind of sat next to the road. So this gives us a minimal space industry that can take a lot of traffic. So all it needs is room for a few cars, and this gives us something to have the yard crew switch during sessions. Now, the 8th Subdivision was designed for operations from the start, and this Junction City Yard is really the nerve center of the railroad operationally. It has our classification tracks where outbound cars are classified to either go westbound towards the WP in California or eastbound toward our interchange connections here in Utah, the D&RGW or the Union Pacific. And this is where local trains are made up. So we have the Milton turn and the Raft River turn built up here waiting for power so that they can go out in the next op session. And then cars for our other local destinations. And typically the yard crew will block cars for our eastbound interchange connections back here. Our future merger partner, Union Pacific, had a heavy presence on the WP in the late 70s, early 80s. There was a lot of run-through power and locomotives that were leased. So as often as you would see Western Pacific power on the WP, you would see Union Pacific locomotives as well. That's another reason to choose the WP as a prototype, because I can model all of our local northern Utah railroads interchanging or using run-through power on my layout. Here we're at the west end of Junction City Yard with the unfinished engine terminal, but it shows power from our interchange partners here as well. And this is where crews will pick up local freight power to take trains out on the road, as well as trains headed westbound towards the rest of the WP main line at Elko, Nevada. But as we leave the yard here at Junction City, aka Ogden, we start to move into the Utah countryside with the farms. And I wanted a transition scene here that didn't have a lot going on to it so that we can not crowd everything. So we have some farms here. We have a railroad grade crossing and cornfields, some irrigation equipment, and so on. And this backdrop and this scene were developed from scenes on the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, WP, all of them kind of wrapped up together. And scenery on this wall of the railroad is pretty shallow. It's only about a foot deep, but it still gives us plenty of space for operations. And the first switching location west of Junction City Yard is at this place called Chester. And it has a couple of larger industries. We have Hudson Press and we have Associated Foods. Utah typical industry, it would be this large warehouse, which is used for cold storage for a grocery distribution center. So we have some things like a beer car, a couple of different refrigerator cars bringing in some perishable items for distribution to our local grocery stores. And there's also this sort of heavily weathered track here in the foreground, which exists as a car storage area that sometimes the yard uses. Like if they have overflow, they'll push cars out here to get them out of the yard. And, sometimes there will be a westbound train that will pick up its cars out here rather than in the yard itself. And at other times, the local that works here will use this to keep its traffic off of the main line. Here's another one of our railroad's more important customers. This is Ideal Portland Cement. And it shows the design philosophy I use for some of my industries. I like things that have a lot of space to them, that convey the look of a big, important customer that gives the railroad a reason that it's making money switching this thing. So this industrial complex is about 6 feet long, and it's a combination of kit bashed and scratch built components everything from pieces of Walther's grain elevator to coal conveyors to a coal bin to some bins scratch built out of various pieces like ABS or PVC pipe or leftover pieces from, a European gravel loader to this building, which is a coal dump, which has scratch built walls that are 60,000 styrene, and it's just a big plain looking thing. But a lot of industries in the prototype are like that. Cement plants are an important thing for me in my history in model railroading because it's really part of what got me interested in the hobby. When my dad and I used to drive around in northern Utah when I was a kid, one of the places we would visit had a big cement plant. And I would sit there for as long as he would let me and watch the Union Pacific switch this big cement plant with these little 2-bay hoppers. And so it was like my formative experience in railroading is watching this industry be switched. So every one of my layouts, I've always had to have a cement plant. And I like to have it be one of the biggest structures around because of the importance of it to me and my hobby. As we move along westbound from our last location at Chester and the cement plant, we come to this river canyon scene. And this is very heavily based on the WP route through the Humboldt River Canyon in northern Nevada. This tunnel, the bridge abutments, this bridge are all modeled after locations in Palisade Canyon, Nevada. But note that between Chester and this scene, we have this hill back here. I needed to hide a turnback curve, and the railroad just runs from the Chester side of the aisle to this side of the aisle through an area that was really too narrow to fit the whole of the turnback curve to where we could see it, because it actually punches through this backdrop over here. And so since that really wasn't something that was scenically viable, I just buried it in this hill. And you can only go so far back here before you lose sight of things. So this scenery ends just right here. There is a hole back there for access, and you can get into the turnback curve. And there's also a helix buried down here that takes us to lower level staging. So this is just a way to get us to wrap around the end of an aisle without having to totally bury everything and just make it look like one big continuous scene. And another thing I'd like to point out here is this is another one of our very narrow areas. We can still make something that looks big and expansive to the viewer without having to take up a lot of space. And this is, again, only about 12 inches deep. Although we aren't showing a train running down here, this is the Raft River branch. This is just below the main track between the towns of Milton and Chester on the top level. And this is our railroad's biggest customer. It's the lumber mill that is one of only 2 businesses that are switched on this Raft River branch. And it's about 11 feet long, but it seems only about 10 inches deep. And some of these structures here are maybe only about 1/4 of an inch thick. But it gives us a way to represent big business and give somebody a lot of traffic to work without taking up a lot of space. So underneath the railroad here, this would otherwise be, wasted opportunity, but we've turned this into something that gives an operator a job that can last all session long. Continuing westbound, we reach the town of Milton, Utah, another rural community. It's home to this grain elevator and a team track. And this is an example of a small space industry that we can model. This team track only has just a little bit of space between the track and the fascia. I have this box truck that's posed here, showing where there are, customers offline that are receiving material here. So we have a bulkhead flat car, probably a load of lumber delivered to a local lumber yard, and they hauled it away. We don't have to model that, and so we can make good use of our space. And we can combine this with space for another customer. In this case, our grain elevator. We have a modern elevator that sits next to an older structure. And the way I'm picturing things is this newer elevator is the only one that's doing shipping on the railroad, and this older one just sort of sits here. But these give us a place to show typical rural industries, and also gives me something to model that was from my travels. The prototype for this structure is in Colorado, and I always thought that this was a really neat, small building that would look good on a model railroad. And as I've explained in a couple of other scenes, gives me a place to model something that you don't see everywhere else. So I like having something that's scratch built and unique. This spur can take quite a few cars more than what this little industry can take itself, because it runs right off the edge of the benchwork. There's a little brass pole there that keeps the cars from running off the edge, but we just presume that that spur heads off that direction a ways, and it gives us a reason why we can spot half a dozen hoppers here at this thing without having to really model the whole length of the track that would be used on the prototype. So another way to save space. When I was designing this town, I knew that I wasn't going to have enough space to model everything in 3D that I might want. So the backdrop carries a lot of information. And for more information on what we are talking about here with backdrops, there's another TSG Multimedia video that we did talking about the philosophy of backdrop design. So go ahead and look that up if you'd like to learn more. The backdrop here behind Milton combines elements of several different Utah scenes, like there will be a barn from one place, a street full of houses from another place. In fact, this street right here is from Lee Nicholas's hometown of Corinne. And I thought, well, if that makes a good typical Utah rural town street, I'll put that here on the railroad. At the west end of Milton, we have this farm scene attempting to replicate typical rural Utah structures again. But also, it provides an opportunity to discuss something I like to call a visual event. It's something that breaks up your view of the train in between point A and point B, and it helps it feel like you're traveling a little bit farther than if the track is just up front and all of our structures and trees and so on are behind it, which we see on so many layouts. So here, you can't get through this scene without having your view of the train blocked by something. And this is another illustration of how we can take a model kit and make it look a little different. This barn is just Walther's plastic structure, but I wanted it to be built into the side of the hill here. So I added a styrene foundation. I built this styrene addition to the structure, and I cut in some windows. And this gives it a little bit of a different look while still making it look very typical. And then I added some weathering on here with watercolor pencils and some acrylics to help make it look like individual boards and make it look like it's not just a lump of plastic. But having all of the vertical changes in the height of the scene, as well as something that hides the train as you move past, it gives our eye a break. We're not just following a train. We're following progress of something through a scene. Like when you drive along the tracks doing rail fanning, you're not going to have a perfect view of the railroad that's unobstructed everywhere. And this helps to replicate that and make us feel like we're looking at part of the real world instead of just something that's in your basement. Continuing westbound, we get to Cedar Creek Canyon. Our main line that we've been following so far is up here on the side of the hill. Down at the bottom, we have the branch line to Raft River that we mentioned earlier as one of the local freights that runs out of Junction City Yard, heads down this branch line. I wanted to discuss this scene because it gives a different perspective on what I discussed with regard to visual events. Typically, we have the scene that starts at the fascia and angles up toward the backdrop. And here, I gave us a rail fan perspective where we might be standing on a hill looking down at the track as it's below us. So we have a hillside that rises on both sides of the railroad that's modeled here. You really can't get a perfect view straight down into the track here. You have to walk to either end. So this gives us another reason to move around and look at our train from different angles, and gives us yet another reason to think that we're not just running a model train, we're out here rail fanning as well. This has a creek that runs downhill through a couple of trestles, and it allows us to give the appearance of a railroad that's moving around through natural features rather than something that's just conveniently sitting on benchwork where the risers and the roadbed put it. One of the things that I wanted to model is our typical Western Utah angled rock layers that are with the fault block mountains that we have everywhere in the Great Basin. So right here, Cedar Creek Canyon shows these rock layers rising up out of the canyon bottom. And we have talus stacked up everywhere. And note that it matches the plaster. And this is one of the things that I like to do with our natural scenery materials is after it's glued in place, dry brush it and airbrush it so it's colored to match the plaster so that it all looks like it came from the same place. Here at Cedar, we have the junction with the Raft River branch. The Raft River branch takes off to that branch line we saw at the bottom of Cedar Creek Canyon. And I wanted to replicate one of the very typical WP local freight switching practices and have a set out track at the junction for the branch line. So here at Cedar, we have main line, passing siding, and this track behind it, which also incorporates a local industry spur. But we can see here there's just a few cars sitting around that are either headed to or from the branch line. And this is an intermediate switching opportunity that gives our local crews something to do as they're out operating, but it doesn't require anything big in terms of a structure or, anything physical plant oriented other than just this track. So we have maybe a hopper that's headed down to the branch line, a box car, and another hopper that are maybe headed westbound. So as the Raft River turn does its work, it will do some switching both going to and from the branch, just setting out and picking up cars right here. And otherwise, this scene can just be an expansive, middle of nowhere rural scene, but it still gives us some intense operation. And right behind the spur is one of my favorite locations on the railroad, which shows our access road to the local industry here, Vickers Land and Livestock, as it crawls up out of the valley and disappears over this ridge. Between the fence posts, the painted shadows, and the bushes here, it's really hard to tell, even for me at times, exactly where the backdrop starts and the 3D scene begins. And also along this area, I've tried to include some of our typical Utah scenery elements, such as some sunflowers, which are all over the place in late summer. And it gives the crews the appearance of operating at the specific time of year being modeled and not just a place. One of the things I wanted to incorporate into the layout as much as possible is open space. Here in the Intermountain West, we have a lot of open areas in between towns and industries, and incorporating as much empty nothing as I can in between scenes on the railroad helps to reinforce the area that's being modeled. So here I had an opportunity to create this long winding grade in between the towns of Lakeview and Cedar, and it's modeled after several different side hill grades on the Western Pacific, including Silver Zone Pass in Nevada, the climb over the Pequops, and Low Hill here in Utah as well. It gives us a place to model drainage features, ditches, culverts, a bridge with some typical WP style abutments, another opportunity to represent our typical rock layers, and also show the engineering of how to get a railroad through the scene. Things like cuts and fills, the sort of thing that if we just concentrate on built up areas, it's easy to forget that's there. This is one of the places where I like to stand and watch a train run. It's fun to watch it angle through the super elevation as the cars move different ways as it climbs the hill. And it gives us a place to, once again, show the type of rail fan view that we would have when we're out there standing on a hillside watching a real WP train climb up to the top of a grade. Here at the end of this aisle, we have another turnback curve, and I wanted to use this opportunity to disguise this obviously too tight model railroad curve. When we look at this scene, we can see that there's only a part of the train that's ever going to be visible here. And the tightest part of the curve is hidden behind this hill, which is modeled after a hill that's just outside of Wendover, Nevada on the WP main line. So we enter from the uphill direction where the curve is, it's just starting to get tight. Where it gets its tightest, you just can't see it at all. And then as we move around into a little bit broader area of the curve, as we come out of it into the town of Lakeview, it becomes visible again. So we minimize the amount of unrealistic, very tight curve that we have to view our train on as it runs downhill. As we get to the town of Lakeview, it's supposed to be very close to the Great Salt Lake and the Salt Flats in the western Utah desert. We have a dry wash that heads under the railroad here on a big fill and empties out into the Salt Flats. And then we come to the town of Lakeview. And Lakeview is the western end of the railroad right before we head into west staging that heads to Elko, Nevada. And it's one of those places that has cheap real estate where they managed to convince another cold storage company to come in and build a big warehouse to get rail service. And here I wanted to have a large industry that can take up to 8 57-foot refrigerator cars, but I didn't want it to take up a ton of space. So I modeled it as if the bulk of the industry is out here in the aisle, and I cut it off. This building is scratch built from 60,000 styrene, and the side that faces the aisle is just painted plain gray so it disappears. And it's modeled as if the whole railroad does not need to have full-size buildings everywhere. We can use whatever space is available and cram in something and then just say, you know what? The fascia is the edge of the world. It's a cross-section and it cuts off. One thing that people often comment about is, well, if you put things between the railroad and the aisle, something might get broken. Well, that's true, but we can also design to minimize that. So in the case of this structure, you know, if somebody reaches across in the process of trying to uncouple a car and they push off one of the air conditioning units, there's these little pieces of styrene that are in the roof that are matched to the bottom of the AC unit. And so all you have to do is snap the thing back on and it causes no harm at all. So designing our buildings to be able to survive damage really isn't that hard. But in this narrow scene, we have several things that give operating interest. We have a ramp here, which is modeled after a ramp that was on the WP out in Nevada. Has a couple of bridge plates here so that we can run up a flat car for offloading equipment. This is also a place where tank cars of acid come in for local mines that use acid for heat bleaching. And then on the opposite side of the main line from our cold storage warehouse is a drilling fluids plant. Another typical Nevada, Utah type industry. This one makes drilling fluids that are sent out in either pressure differential hoppers or in 55-gallon drums for the oil field industry. And the prototype of this is located, I believe, along the Southern Pacific, just outside of Battle Mountain. And it has a fairly narrow footprint, but long enough that it looks like a major customer so that we can spot our pressure differential hoppers here and cars to be loaded with 55-gallon drums here. And using the minimal space available, we can still give a pretty credible representation of an industry that should take rail service. Here's another one of the 8 subs larger industries. This is Morton Salt at Lakeview. And the salt industry is something that has a lot of plants that have existed along the Western Pacific, UP, and the Southern Pacific. And they take minerals from the sediments in the Great Salt Lake and they evaporate the water out and that leaves the salt behind. This was inspired by the Morton Salt plant that is along the old Western Pacific out by Tooele, but it doesn't actually copy anything in particular, and it's a good excuse to use all kinds of scrap box parts to create something. So leftover pieces from kit bash structures were incorporated here to give a typical appearance of something that has been modernized over time and at least looks logical and doesn't look like something that you just pulled out of a box. So we have parts of a Walther's gravel plant, parts of a flour mill, some modular pieces, some leftover chemical plant stuff, and various other parts. But they were all modeled from photographs of prototypes, plants that do salt, and that allowed us to create something that you can't quite put your finger on exactly what it is. It just looks like a typical industry. This ends our visit to the Western Pacific 8th Subdivision. Hope you found something in the presentation that you could learn from or be inspired by, or maybe something you decided not to do. But anyway, thanks for watching.